This may come as a shock to cultural pluralists in America today, but the idea of religious toleration was championed and somewhat achieved in the British colonies as early as 1633. At that time, the Virginia Company was still governing southern colonial lands from its capital at Jamestown, and William Bradford, who had crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower in 1620 and was a signatory on the Mayflower Compact, was busy acting as the governor of the Plymouth colony. In 1633, colonial authority was delegated by the Crown to officials at Plymouth, Salem in the north, and Jamestown in the south. After Jamestown failed to achieve its original purpose to find gold, silver, and a river passage to the Pacific, more realistic economic opportunities were pursued. Hence, the idea of colonial plantations. As was the case with the plantation of Ulster, which was started by King James Stuart of Sixth of Scotland and First of England around 1608, the American colonies were by 1620 thought to be plantations. As in the movie Gone with the Wind, a large farming operation like Scarlett's Tara was classified as a plantation. The Stuarts' plantation policy in Ireland, America, was aimed at fostering the formation of an agrarian economy and society that would ultimately benefit England. While the members of the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies were at least nominally Christian, they were theologically and politically quite different from each other. Puritan separatists worshipped under the leadership and authority of a congregation, but the Church of England was an Episcopal system and featured bishops appointed by the monarch, so the king was in charge of worship in Jamestown. The two colonies were also about 500 miles apart, so consequently, communication with each other was limited. It's important to consider that in the late 1630s and 1640s, England, Scotland, and Ireland were embroiled in a civil war. That civil war had as much to do with religion as it did anything else. Increasingly, religious minorities, mainly Catholics, Baptists, and Quakers, sought a place to live peacefully. As with the persecuted Puritan separatists in Plymouth, their eyes shifted to America. Today on The Vantage Point, we're going to take a look at what religious toleration and diversity looked like in the American colonies in the 17th century. I hope you'll join me. One should not simply view the American colonies as if they were isolated islands. They were, after all, projects of powerful people in Great Britain and Ireland. Despite his somewhat clumsy and uncouth manner, King James Stuart I of England, Sixth of Scotland, was a powerful and pragmatic monarch. James was, to say the least, an interesting fellow. He was committed to his role as a lieutenant of Christ on earth, so he believed in the divine right of kings. In 1599, some 4 years before he inherited the English crown from Elizabeth I, his cousin, James published Basilicon Doron, which in ancient Greek meant royal gift. In its original form, the document was a letter to his eldest son, Henry, Duke of Rothesay. Essentially, it was a treatise on government, Christian living, and the divine right of kings. However, James had cut his teeth on politics in Scotland. He knew when to let go of unpopular ideas. James had spent most of his youth at Stirling Castle in Scotland. The ungainly young king was raised without a parent and under the condescending tutelage of George Buchanan. After James died in 1625, his son Charles I ascended to the thrones of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Unlike his father, he was raised at court in London and was much more sheltered than James. To his detriment, Charles took to heart the idea of the divine right of kings. While Charles was asserting himself unfavorably among the faithful across the island of Great Britain and Ireland, more and more of his subjects were seeking exile in America. While New England and Virginia were attracting new settlers, the middle colonies were especially attractive to religious minorities. Roger Williams was born in 1603 at about the same time that King James I inherited the English throne from his cousin Elizabeth I. As a young man, Williams went to Cambridge University and was ordained a minister in the Church of England, with the monarchy over. Cambridge was a hotbed of Puritan thinking in the 17th century. So Williams eventually embraced the idea that freedom of conscience, which he called soul liberty, was not possible in a centralized and hence controlled church body that blurred the lines between governance of the civil authorities and religious practice. He believed that the government had a corrupting influence in the church, not the other way around. He believed that a person who had an open and God-seeking heart would find truth and unity with other believers. Like many other Puritans in Scotland and Ireland, Williams believed that Christ could not be divided, and that the Spirit would lead the earnest true believer to be united in peace with other followers of Christ. I'm not at all sure how he rationalized Luke 12:51, where Jesus declared that he had come to divide, not bring peace. Soon after marrying his sweetheart, Mary Barnard, he left England for Massachusetts, where he hoped to find a job as a preacher and a pure expression of the faith among other Puritans. He first tried to settle in Salem and eventually moved on to Plymouth Colony. He soon fell out of favor with Governor John Winthrop of the Salem or Massachusetts Bay Colony and Governor William Bradford of the Plymouth Colony. He just didn't get along with these people because he took issue with the way the elders ruled over Christian worship. Because of his anti-establishment views, the elders in Salem and Plymouth would not let him preach. To make a living, he developed a trade business with Native Americans. Due to his anti-establishment rantings, Williams was banished from Massachusetts in 1636 for heresy and sedition. Because he had established economic ties with members of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett tribes in what is today Rhode Island, he relocated there, and he enjoyed the fact that a number of his followers relocated with him. They established Providence, a settlement that clearly had a teleological view of life. After all, they believed that God was behind their settlement in Providence and the creation of the Rhode Island colony. Williams went on to serve as president of the Rhode Island colony from 1654 to 1657. The young preacher had a paradoxical personality for sure. While publicly arguing for an anti-establishment approach to government and a free expression of corporate worship, he was steadfastly a Christian and accepted adult or believer baptism in 1638. He became a Baptist. He did not object to a person's religious convictions playing a role in how he governed. His idea of soul liberty made any other perspective virtually impossible. It was the involvement of the state in organized religion that he resented. He's also credited with being the co-founder of the first Baptist church in America. It's almost as if he was an early version of Jimmy Carter. He was personally pious, but outwardly quite liberal, although he wrote scathing essays on the theological underpinnings or foundation of Quakerism, and he attacked its leader, George Fox. Looking south of Providence in 1632, we find the administration of Cecil Calvert, 2nd Baron Baltimore, also known as Lord Baltimore. Even with a time machine, we would not be able to find good old Cecil Calvert in Maryland. Talking about working remotely, he served as the proprietor for the colony for 43 years, but he never set foot in Maryland. He employed his brother and other trusted employees to establish and manage the colony. With the British Civil War looming on the horizon, Lord Baltimore, who was a good politician and also a Catholic, had a deep interest in resettling Catholics in the colonies. Just after the execution of Charles I in 1649, Lord Baltimore's administration passed the Maryland Toleration Act. Some modern observers think that the act was too weak because it only included Trinitarian Christians, but Jews were also welcome. Despite that criticism, the ideas of freedom and religious diversity, albeit within the Judeo-Christian world, which is what most of Western Europe was revolutionary for its time. Consider that almost a century later in Ireland, couples who were married in non-established Christian churches like the Baptist and Presbyterian congregations, and Quakers too, were arrested for living together illegally. And funerals for Presbyterians, Baptists, and Quakers were also held up until a minister from the Church of Ireland, the state church, or established church, delivered the eulogy. While Maryland served Lord Baltimore's purpose for Catholics, there was no shortage of Protestants settling in the colony. In 1683, Reverend Francis Makemie, a distant uncle of mine and a fellow graduate of the University of Glasgow in Scotland, established the first Presbyterian church at Rehoboth in Delaware. Well, I hope you got something out of today's show, and if you did, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you again here on The Vantage Point. God bless you and yours. Bye-bye.